Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking a really meticulous journey into a very specific frontier moment. The British encounter with the region around Dera Ismail Khan. And we're going to focus tightly on a village called Draban and the colossal mountain that looms over it, Takht-e-Sulaiman.
Right.
Our mission really is to trace nearly a century of this engagement from about 1808 all the way to 1891 and to see how the very act of observing, of classifying and mapping this landscape actually fundamentally transformed it.
It's really a deep dive into historical epistemology, you could say. We're looking at a clash between two just fundamentally different systems of knowledge, and our starting point is very precise. 1808 to 1809. It's this moment when the systematic intellectual toolkit of Western civilization, specifically the European Enlightenment, makes its first real formal contact with this decentralized, kinship-based world of the Pashtun and Baloch societies there on the Damaan plain.
Okay, let's unpack the why of that contact. Because when the British envoy, Mountstuart Elphinstone, shows up near Dera Ismail Khan, he's not just a simple diplomat with a few treaties in his bag.
No, not at all.
He is, whether he knows it or not, an agent of a civilization that's going through this massive intellectual and industrial revolution. This mindset is his real intellectual cargo.
And the reason he's even there is just a fantastic illustration of global connectivity. That whole mission was born not out of some local ambition, but out of, geopolitical terror happening far away in Europe.
You mean Napoleon?
We are talking about the anxiety generated by Napoleon Bonaparte. I mean, if you remember that famous story of the philosopher Hegel sees Napoleon ride through Jena in 1806, and he calls him the Weltgeist, the world soul on horseback.
The world soul. That's a terrifying modern kind of force.
Exactly. And by 1808, that world soul is forcing the British East India Company to look very urgently beyond India's borders. Napoleon had allied with Russia, and there was this real threat that he could move through Persia and Afghanistan and just completely undermine British control of the subcontinent.
Right.
So that strategic panic, that distant shadow of French ambition, is what sends Elphinstone on this desperate diplomatic mission to secure an alliance in Kabul. And that's what lands him, almost by accident, in Dera Ismail Khan.
So this European revolutionary destiny, symbolized by Napoleon, inadvertently forces the British to catalog and define a remote village like Draban. That's the high-level context. So our mission today is to track the evolution of this imperial gaze. It starts as this scholarly classification, Elphinstone, just observing.
Right.
It then shifts into active aggressive strategy during the Great Game. We're talking Burns and his intelligence work. Then it becomes just brutal, raw administration under a guy named Edwardes. And then finally, it all culminates in this incredibly symbolic conquest, the fixed physical measurement of that imposing mountain, Takht-e-Sulaiman, in 1891.
And for you, the listener, the central idea to hold on to here is this deep tension. The British were busy constructing what you could call a knowledge of surface maps, censuses, fixed administrative lines, numerical certainty.
Right, the hard data.
The hard data. But the local tribes who are living by these complex indigenous codes like Pashtunwali, they already possessed a superior knowledge of depth, the hidden paths, the intricate family connections, the cultural and spiritual meaning of the land itself. That battle between the map and the lived reality really defines the entire century we're about to explore.
So let's start with him, with Mountstuart Elphinstone, the architect of this foundational gaze. I mean, his importance goes way beyond just simple diplomacy, doesn't it? He was deeply steeped in the intellectual world of the late Scottish Enlightenment. So when he gets to the Darajat, what is that intellectual tradition of, say, David Hume and Adam Smith? What does that actually mean for how he approaches a completely new and unfamiliar society?
It means his approach was just fundamentally different from the raw, aggressive conquest mindset you might have seen in earlier colonial ventures. The Scottish Enlightenment, it valued empiricism above all else, the systematic gathering of facts through observation and experience.
So look first, act later.
Exactly. Hume emphasized understanding human nature, and Adam Smith was all about political economy, understanding how societies organize wealth and labor. Elphinstone took that whole belief system and he just applied it. He believed you must understand a society's deep structure, its customs, its economic networks, before you can even think about governing it effectively.
So his curiosity wasn't just, idle tourism. It was a systematizing, pragmatic tool for future control. The sources say he applied a Kantian-inspired urge for systematic explanation to the social cosmos of the Darajat.
Absolutely. I mean, think of Kant's whole project, this urge to categorize and structure reality, to put everything in a neat, rational box. Elphinstone's mission was basically to transform the bewildering, fluid reality of the frontier into fixed, knowable data points for the empire. He had to chart this unknown universe, even if it meant painstakingly documenting every last detail, right down to the composition of a mud wall.
And the contrast, when you think about it, is just spectacular. It really helps to place him culturally. The sources remind us that in 1808, while Elphinstone is slogging through the dust and heat near the Indus, Beethoven is in Vienna, premiering his Fifth Symphony.
Wow.
An anthem to modern individualism, to change, to revolutionary spirit. But in Dera Ismail Khan, that world was literally dark. No electricity, still waiting for Faraday's discoveries. Elphinstone was carrying this invisible weight of European intellectual ferment into a world still defined by ancient codes and seasonal rhythms.
And that invisible weight, it dictates his priorities. So his focus first is on Dera Ismail Khan as a strategic and economic snapshot. He documents it not really as a political center, it was under this loose Afghan suzerainty, but as a critical Balak-dominated trading hub.
Its value was its location.
Its location, connecting Central Asian commerce, horses, furs, dried fruit, with the markets of the subcontinent. It was a potential node in this emerging imperial network he was imagining.
And we get such vivid, specific details from his account that really bring the place to life. There's that great anecdote about his reception by the Balak deputy, a man named Futteh Khan. What does that exchange tell us about how local power was projected?
Oh, Futteh Khan's reception is a pure performance of power, and it's calibrated for the foreign visitor. He wasn't subtle about it. He was boasting about his master's martial capabilities.
What did he say?
He talks about 20 forts and 40 blacksmiths working night and day to make cannon shot. He wanted Elphinstone to understand in no uncertain terms that this territory was defended by real local muscle. It's formal diplomacy, but it's punctuated by this local swagger.
The gift he received. 6 bottles of Kabul wine. It's a tiny detail, but it speaks volumes about the trade networks that were crisscrossing this landscape, doesn't it?
It does. It shows that even in this remote place, there were connections to the Afghan interior. He's just quietly cataloging every single detail. The walls of unburnt bricks, the commercial goods, the ethnic mix of Balak, Afghan, and Hindu people living there.
So while Futteh Khan is asserting local power with these visible signs of military force,
Elphinstone is silently absorbing and classifying every single piece of data. He's creating the colonial cognitive map, translating local boasts into strategic statistics for later use.
this is where Elphinstone's Enlightenment urge for classification becomes almost, unsettling. I'm thinking of his early ethnography of the Kharotis. He runs into these Kharoti shepherds who he describes as the rudest of all the pastoral tribes out on this vast plain. Why did he spend so much time dissecting their material culture and their appearance?
It was part of that universalizing project of the Enlightenment. They weren't just curious about differences, they were searching for universal types within local variants. They were comparing the physiognomy they saw on the frontier against the classical and contemporary ideas of human types that were being developed back in Europe.
Which explains those really striking descriptions. He noted the girls had Jewish features and one young man looked like an Irish haymaker. It sounds so subjective, even arbitrary to us now.
It does, but at the time it was a rigorous, if deeply flawed attempt to fit this fluid reality into European racial and cultural categories.
And that urge to categorize, to fix identity, is what generates, I think, the most poignant insight of this entire encounter. After all the measuring and classifying, the tables are suddenly turned by a simple question from one of the shepherds.
That question, for me, is the moral anchor of this whole century-long engagement. The Kharoti shepherd steps forward and asks Elphinstone directly, whether we were not contented with our own possessions, Kanpur and Lucknow and all those fine places.
Wow.
That single sentence just cuts through all the philosophical and strategic justifications of the British mission. It's the unfiltered voice of the frontier asking, why are you here? Why are you crossing this line?
Or what do you want?
Exactly. And the fact that Elphinstone bothered to meticulously record that question confirms that he understood, even at this very foundational stage, that the British presence was already being seen as an inexorable expansionist threat. This was maybe the most critical piece of intelligence he gathered. This deep-seated indigenous suspicion. The map of the terrain might have been blank, but the map of local intentions was already drawn.
Let's shift our focus now to Draban, or Daroban, as it was first recorded. This becomes the staging ground for the first great imperial failure of the century, the attempt to climb Takht-e-Sulaiman. Elphinstone himself didn't go, but his companions, a Mr. Fraser and a Lieutenant Harris, they made the push. How did Elphinstone see Draban?
He saw it primarily as a strategic Myankel settlement, a neat little town on a fine, clear, cold stream, as he put it. Its significance was defensive. It was the last major Pashtun outpost before you got into the really difficult hill country. He was mapping not just geography, but social power.
And that social power was highly stratified, which he was very quick to note.
Precisely. The Pashtun tribes, specifically the Myankels, they were the dominant land-owning aristocracy. But the land itself was worked by Saraiki-speaking jack cultivators, the Rayats or Mazaras. Elphinstone described their condition, quite frankly, as wretched.
So he's already setting up these class distinctions that the British would later formalize.
Exactly. Using the dominant landowners, the Myankels, as collaborators or as agents for revenue collection down the line.
Now, the journey to the mountain itself was driven by this deep historical and spiritual curiosity. They were expecting to reach the peak that was believed locally to be the spot where Noah's Ark rested, or the throne of Solomon. It's a powerful mix of biblical and Islamic tradition.
It is. And Fraser and Harris were welcomed by Umar Khan, who's described as this handsome young Myankul chief.
And Umar Khan is the perfect personification of the frontier's dual nature, isn't he?
He really is. He's this charming, capable local authority who is, at the same time, extending lavish hospitality Melmastia while also fighting for his political life. They were offered the best local food, including a pillow made with the fat of the famed Dumba sheep. But his confidence was clearly being undermined by internal strife.
So much so that he asks these foreign visitors for a talisman for success against his own tribal factions.
It's an incredible moment.
The representative of the scientifically minded Enlightenment, armed with these new tools of global power, is being asked for a magical charm by the most powerful local man they've met.
That detail is just a profound collision of belief systems. On one hand, Umar Khan recognizes the superior military and political power these foreigners represent. He wants a piece of that intangible strength. But on the other hand, he understands power through the lens of local belief and ritual.
Right.
The moment just underscores the extreme dependency the British had on local patronage. Umar Khan was the only reason they got past Draban and into the difficult Shirani country, and he knew it.
And he immediately acknowledged the dangers. He advised them to cover themselves up, look like locals, and leave their Indian attendants behind, confirming that even under his protection, they were entering hostile, unknown territory.
And the ascent, predictably, was a failure. They were thwarted by heavy snow, difficult terrain, and the realization that their supposed 12-mile journey actually meant 3 more days of travel. It was impossible given their diplomatic schedule. But the failure wasn't just logistical.
No, it was political.
Deeply political.
And that political failure is just brutally demonstrated on the return trip. The moment they leave Umar Khan's immediate sphere of influence, they're ambushed by a party commanded by Umar Khan's own nephew.
It's a perfect illustration of a segmentary, stateless society. Umar Khan's protection extended only as far as his direct political control. His nephew felt at full liberty to plunder them the moment they were outside the protective shadow of the Myankul chief. It just shows the fluidity of tribal loyalty and the limits of any negotiated peace.
The danger culminates in that truly dramatic moment. A man on foot, ignoring their pleas to stop, deliberately taking aim at Lieutenant Harris with a matchlock rifle fixed on its rest.
It's terrifying. And it took their guide, their local guarantor, to physically intervene and save Harris's life.
So this single incident in 1809 just crystallizes the entire Elphinstone era encounter.
It really does. You have the initial meticulous observation of social structure, an attempt at scientific conquest with the mountain ascent, and then it's followed by this swift, violent demonstration of the utter precarity and the limits of imperial power.
The whole scholarly and diplomatic venture was completely dependent on the fickle, shifting alliances of the local chiefs.
Utterly. The lesson they learned early on was that the mountain was closed, and not just by snow, but by the determined will of the tribes who controlled every single pathway leading to it. The British had the philosophical tools, but it was the Karaiti and the Myankal who held the keys to the land.
So a generation passes. By the 1830s, the British focus shifts dramatically from this diplomatic curiosity to active strategy, and it's driven by the escalating great game competition with Russia.
Right.
And we see a new breed of traveler. The immersive ethnographer Godfrey Thomas Vigne, and the aggressive imperial strategist Sir Alexander Bokhara Burns.
Vigne is crucial because he translates the landscape into a psychological frontier. He was a traveler and a sportsman, not an official diplomat.
Sorry.
And his accounts captured Dera Ismail Khan as this visceral, palpable threshold. East of the Indus, you had Sikh territory and relative security.
And west of it.
West of it, where Draban was, that was a zone of ultimate vulnerability, where travel was only possible through these very tenuous agreements.
That concept of securing radari-safe passage, that's central to understanding the governance vacuum, isn't it? It meant your travel rights were based purely on temporary patronage and a negotiated contract, not on any right guaranteed by a state or by law.
And Vigne captured the essence of Pashtunwali, the Pashtun code of conduct, as a completely self-sufficient and internally logical social system. He saw that swift duality in action, the intense, lavish hospitality, the milmastia that could suddenly flip into violence governed by codes of honor, izzat, and blood retaliation, badal.
And he was seeing local leaders.
He was observing local leaders, especially in places like Draban, who were just masters at playing the recently arrived Sikh authorities against the British presence. They were always maintaining their own autonomous spheres in the hills, ensuring that no single outside power could ever claim true mastery.
He also deepened the understanding of Takht-e-Sulaiman. Elphinstone noted its mythology, but Vigne realized its cultural power.
Yes, he connected it directly to the Prophet Solomon. He recognized that claiming the mountain wasn't just a physical conquest. It was a profound symbolic challenge to an indigenous sacred geography.
For Vigne, the mountain was a living symbol of legitimacy.
It was. To claim the mountain was to challenge the protective, timeless authority it represented to the guardian tribes, the Shiranis. His insight really defined the symbolic stakes for the decades of military confrontation that would follow.
Okay, now let's turn to Burns. If Elphinstone was the Enlightenment ethnographer, Burns was the architect of the Great Game. He took Elphinstone's meticulous observations and translated them directly into an active, aggressive imperial blueprint.
Burns was the quintessential engineer of empire. He was driven by this urgency of countering Russian expansionism in Central Asia. His 1834 work, Travels into Bokhara, it didn't just describe the region, it prescribed how the British should conquer and manage it.
Right.
He explicitly championed the Indus River as Britain's Mississippi.
Britain's Mississippi. That analogy is brilliant for illustrating the strategic shift. I mean, the Mississippi was the artery of American expansion and internal commerce.
And Burns saw the Indus as exactly the same thing, a liquid highway for imperial control, transforming the frontier from a defensive barrier into a launch pad.
It marked a decisive shift from description to engineering.
Absolutely. Burns identified Dera Ismail Khan as the ideal point d'appui, the base of operations for campaigns toward Kandahar and the Afghan interior. His focus was entirely on intelligence gathering. Detailed charts of the river, precise estimates of troop movements, the strategic value of crucial passes. His writing wasn't academic travel writing, it was an immediately classified blueprint.
But even this architect of aggressive expansion had to acknowledge the limits of imperial confidence, right?
Mm-hmm.
He confirmed Elphinstone's earlier intuition.
Oh, absolutely. Brains traveled widely enough to confirm that imperial confidence meant very little in the face of local autonomy. He admitted that crucial transit routes, like the Gomal Pass, which was vital for the flow of Central Asian goods, could be opened or closed entirely at the will of the local tribal leaders.
So his charts might map the routes.
But the tribes held the functional keys to the gates. And ironically, his own assassination in Kabul in 1841 tragically proved the accuracy of his own assessment. Imperial strategy was fundamentally vulnerable to indigenous retaliation.
So after the Second Anglo-Sikh War and the annexation of the Punjab in 1849, the British suddenly inherit this entire frontier problem. The Great Game moves from strategic plotting to raw, boots-on-the-ground administration.
Mm-hmm.
This brings us to Herbert Benjamin Edwardes, who faced the brutal reality of just holding the line.
Edwards' memoir, A Year on the Punjab Frontier, is just essential reading for understanding this phase. He describes the frontier as a permanent land of suspense. Dera Ismail Khan was immediately transformed from a trading hub into a fortified garrison outpost.
And the political reality was stark.
It was. The British held the settled plain by day, but the tribes held the hills and the surrounding areas by night. So maintaining stability was his challenge, and it required this highly volatile system based on cash and coercion.
Let's detail that system, this coercive diplomacy. Edwards formalized the practice of tribal subsidies, or muajib. And this wasn't just bribery, was it? It was a formalized contract designed to outsource frontier security.
It was a sophisticated, if, cynical political tool. He paid specific, powerful clans like the Shiranis to keep designated passes open, patrol strategic routes, and, crucially, to police their own members to stop raids into settled territory.
The goal was to turn these decentralized tribal leaders into accountable, salaried agents of the state.
Exactly, defining frontier policy through payment rather than through continuous warfare. But of course, this system often failed when payments lagged or when internal tribal feuds proved stronger than British silver.
And when the Mujib failed, the response was swift and brutal. The punitive expeditions.
The punitive expeditions were known locally as Baramta, and Edwardes governed through this punishing cycle. First, a tribal raid, a Lashkar hits the plain. Then, a military column launches the Baramta into the hills.
And the objective wasn't necessarily to catch the raiders.
No, not at all. The goal was to destroy the economic base of the hill settlements, burning crops, seizing livestock, dismantling fortified towers. The ensuing pressure would force the tribes back to the table for negotiations with British political officers and their local jirgas, their councils.
Edwards' brilliance, though, was that he didn't view the Lashkar, the Tridal raid, as just random banditry.
Right.
He saw it differently.
He reframed it. He analyzed the Lashkar not as simple crime, but as a systemic, seasonal, economic, and social institution that was central to hill society. Raiding was a form of wealth redistribution, a way of settling debts of honor or babal, and a way for young men to gain social standing.
So by recognizing that economic and social logic, the British could develop targeted policies to disrupt the institution, rather than just treating it as isolated lawlessness.
Precisely.
So for Edwards, looking up from his new garrison, what did the unconquered mountain of Takht-e-Sulaiman still represent?
It was an unrelenting visual and psychological affront. That snow-capped summit symbolized the persistent, defiant spirit of tribal resistance. If the British could map every inch of the plain, the mountain remained the ultimate indicator of the limits of their dominion. It was a physical challenge that constantly undermined their claim to total control.
And conversely, for the tribes, the mountain's inviolability was their supreme symbol of sovereignty.
Absolutely. The tribes saw the mountain as the physical manifestation of their protective traditions and their geographic advantage. Every failed British attempt to conquer it just reinforced their indigenous worldview that their system Pashtunwali was superior and protective. It was, as the sources say, a profound psychological battleground that had to be resolved, or the British claim to control would always remain hollow.
Moving into the 1880s, the frontier matures into a bureaucratic enterprise. The raw military administration gives way to systematic knowledge production, exemplified by a man named Edward E. Oliver. This is where the gaze becomes purely administrative.
This is the era of systematic codification, the vast colonial project of classifying the colonized world for efficient management. Oliver's detailed ethnographic studies, like across the border, they weren't just descriptions, they were manuals for governance. He systematically cataloged genealogies, he meticulously dissected the intricacies of blood feud, badal, and he analyzed the political roles of religious figures, mullahs and peers, to inform what were often very divisive divide and rule policies.
And all this knowledge was channeled into the Darajat District Gazetteer of 1883-84. What was the political function of a gazetteer like that?
It was an act of administrative freezing. The British were obsessed with fixing fluid reality into permanent numerical categories. The gazetteer formalized precise statistics on land revenue, soil types, population, and most crucially, it created the meticulous recording of officially recognized Malik, or headmen.
Let's focus on that Malak system, because the Pashtun social system was segmentary and decentralized. The chief who was powerful today might not be tomorrow.
Right.
So what was the imperial intent behind recording and formalizing the Malik?
The intent was to impose the order of the European centralized state onto a stateless society. By designating specific individuals as officially recognized Malik, the British tried to freeze a fluid, kinship-based political system into a fixed official hierarchy. They wanted someone they could hold accountable for revenue and for peace. If a raid occurred, they knew exactly which Malik to fine or punish or dismiss.
So it was a deliberate strategy to dismantle the fluid, negotiated nature of tribal leadership and replace it with a bureaucratic, state-dependent structure.
Exactly.
So we have this clear central-long arc of the imperial gaze. Elphinstone observes, Burns maps strategically, Edwards militarizes and punishes, and then Oliver bureaucratizes the population. The only thing left to conquer, intellectually and physically, is the final symbol of resistance, the mountain itself.
The push to conquer the mountain was really the culmination of the British scientific and intellectual project, and it was framed as part of the Great Trigonometric Survey of India. The objective was to eradicate the cartographic blankness of the frontier, to replace myth and approximation and ambiguity with pure mathematical certainty.
That fixation on mathematical certainty, it sounds like intellectual possession. The idea that once you can measure it precisely, you own it.
It absolutely was an act of intellectual possession. For Victorian science, knowledge was control. They needed to fix every landscape feature onto a precise empire-wide grid. But this was incredibly dangerous work. Surveyors couldn't just wander around with their theodolites.
The sources mention the clandestine nature of this labor. Surveyors sometimes disguise themselves as fakirs or holy men, using plane-table surveying and triangulation from hidden vantage points.
Because discovery meant instant death or severe reprisal. And Takht-e-Sulaiman was the constant, tantalizing focal point in all their triangulation calculations. It was visible for hundreds of miles, yet it remained untouched, a blank space on their high-precision military maps. It represented the final, defiant challenge to the Victorian belief in universal scientific mastery.
And this defiance ends on June 2nd, 1891, with the successful ascent by Captain Thomas Henry Digges Latouche McMahon of the Royal Engineers. This moment is just loaded with symbolic weight, the triumph of technology and Victorian will.
McMahon's climb wasn't just a physical feat, it was a ritual of scientific dominance. He didn't just get to the top, he planted his theodolite, the ultimate symbol of rational measurement, on the throne of Solomon, and spent hours taking observations, meticulously calculating angles.
And he fixed its height.
He successfully fixed the mountain's definitive altitude at 11,295 feet or 3,443 meters. The mountain, which had defined the limit of imperial reach for 80 years, had finally been reduced to a numerical datum in a survey ledger.
But the logistics of this victory, I think, are what reveal the central ambiguity of the whole project. He achieved scientific victory, but only by relying completely on local knowledge of depth.
That's the perfect paradox, isn't it? His scientific instruments and his precise calculations required the indispensable local expertise of the Sharani hunters. The climb was complex, scrambling over precipitous limestone scree, navigating narrow ridges.
They had to negotiate.
He had to enter into complex negotiations and make promises of payment just to secure guidance and protection. His ultimate success depended on the very people whose authority the act of measurement was intended to undermine.
So if we step back, what was the real significance of this conquest? Was it a true victory for the empire?
It was a hollow victory. The British achieved the ultimate knowledge of surface absolute scientific accuracy, but they utterly failed to conquer the cultural meaning, the knowledge of depth. Local tribesmen, even those who guided McMahon, viewed the ascent as a profound transgression, a sacrilege, a violation of a sacred space.
So the mountain's physical dimensions were now fixed on a British map.
But the spiritual and political authority it symbolized remained firmly rooted in the valleys and in the people who protected it. The rock was measured, but the story endured. The map never fully superseded the myth.
We began our journey with Elphinstone's observations in the village of Draban in 1809. Let's return there to see how this century of imperial measurement and administration translated into ground-level reality. Draban serves as a perfect microcosm.
It does. Elphinstone's initial categorization of Draban as a stratified Miankal settlement directly dictated its future administrative handling. Once the British annexed the Punjab, bureaucracy followed the army. They imposed a formal administrative grid onto a landscape that had previously been fluid.
And this meant introducing the rigid structures of the centralized state, district courts, the establishment of segregated civil lines, the residential area for British officials, and eventually cantonments at Dera Ismail Khan just down the road in 1894.
And at the village level, they imposed the tapa system, which was a geographical arrangement for revenue. They appointed Lamberdars, village headmen, who were accountable for revenue collection. And they often co-opted the pre-existing Pashtun power structure, confirming the Miankals in positions of authority, thereby institutionalizing the social stratification Elphinstone had first observed.
Infrastructure was both a tool of control and a catalyst for change. The roads, like the strategic road to Zab, the telegraph lines, strategic forest plantations, how did those alter local life in a place like Draban?
They irrevocably altered local trade and movement patterns. That infrastructure wasn't built for local commerce. It was built for military communication and swift deployment. It made villages like Draban accessible and vulnerable to new forms of state extraction, taxation, conscription, fines that just hadn't existed under the loose Afghan or Sikh suzerainty.
So the roads redirected economic activity.
Away from traditional caravan routes and toward the district headquarters, fundamentally subordinating local autonomy to the needs of the imperial center.
This leads us to the unique structure of frontier governmentality the British developed. This deliberate policy of indirect rule. Why did they choose not to impose full, straightforward British law?
Because the goal was control, not assimilation, and they needed a buffer zone. The British relied heavily on indirect rule through those co-opted tribal malaks, and they administered justice not through courts, but through exceptional legal instruments. And this is where the Frontier Crimes Regulation, the FCR of 1872, becomes absolutely essential.
The FCR is infamous. It's often called a black law. Can you break down how this regulation worked and why it was so effective for the British?
The FCR was a deliberate, politically motivated piece of legislation. It allowed the administration to bypass regular British Indian law and administer justice based on tribal custom, specifically through the Jirga, the Council of Elders. The key feature was the principle of collective responsibility, known as the HAD.
Collective responsibility.
Yes. If a crime was committed by one member of a clan, the entire clan or village was collectively responsible for paying the fine or surrendering the individual.
That seems incredibly effective for control, but utterly opposed to the principles of British common law.
It was a conscious rejection of their own legal principles for strategic benefit. It was Machiavellian. By using the FCR, the British maintained a perpetual political and economic buffer. They deliberately maintained a state of controlled autonomy in the tribal areas, allowing political and economic underdevelopment to persist.
So this legal mechanism, far more than the maps or the roads, created the lasting, enduring administrative and political distinction between settled districts and tribal areas that persisted for decades after independence.
It institutionalized the frontier, exactly.
So in essence, the British created a legal and political firewall that contained, but never resolved, the tension between state control and tribal autonomy.
That's it. They built this exhaustive archive of knowledge of surface, all those gazetteers and maps, but they functionally admitted their failure to achieve true mastery over the knowledge of depth, the lineage, the hidden pathways, the cultural systems of Pashtunwali, by freezing the region in this state of exceptional governance.
And if we look at the remnants today, what physical and intellectual traces are still there from this century-long engagement?
The physical remnants are integrated right into the modern landscape. You can see the sturdy, defensive architecture of old frontier constabulary posts, former British dak bungalows or rest houses in Draban, Razinda, Zarqani. The geometric grid pattern of Dera Ismail Khan's civil lines is still distinct, a testament to that planned colonial order.
And the roads.
And the road networks, initially built for military strategy, now form major national arteries like the N50 National Highway.
And the intellectual legacy is just as pervasive.
It is the most persistent trace. The very ethnographic categories and spatial understandings of the region, the delineation of what is tribal versus settled, accountable versus autonomous, all of that was established by Elphinstone in 1809 and refined through the FCR. These classifications continue to shape the region's political and social identity long after the empire itself is dissolved.
So this deep dive into a single century in a single village really offers some powerful insights into the mechanics of imperial expansion. It shows us that technology and bureaucratic rationality alone just could not overcome these deeply rooted social systems, these stateless, segmentary tribal societies that were so exquisitely adapted to the terrain.
It confirms the fundamental limit of centralized imperial models. The British built this massive knowledge of surface archive, the maps, the census data, the bureaucratic categories. Yet they consistently failed to achieve true, applied mastery over the knowledge of depth, the intimate, locally held understanding of lineage and terrain that constituted true indigenous sovereignty.
They could measure the rock, but they couldn't control the will of the people on it.
Well said.
And the mountain, Takht-e-Sulaiman, it stands as the perfect symbol of this conflict. It moved from a mythological landmark in Elphinstone's journal to a sacred site in Vigne's narrative, a strategic military objective for Burns, a symbol of outright defiance for Edwardes, and then finally, just a scientific datum for McMahon. Its physical reality never changed, but its political and spiritual meaning was continuously contested.
And the entire progression from Enlightenment curiosity to scientific conquest was a continuous process of rendering a complex, fluid reality into fixed, knowable categories. In the end, the British didn't just leave behind barracks and roads, they left behind enduring ways of seeing, of categorizing, and of governing that created the lasting, unresolved distinction between settled districts and tribal areas.
So what does this all mean for the contemporary world? The tension we began with between centralized state authority and decentralized tribal autonomy, it remains contained but fundamentally unresolved. The FCR system was the administrative truce that contained this conflict.
It was. And this leads us to our final provocative thought for you to consider. The ultimate measure of the British conquest was not the height of the mountain, that precise 11,295 feet that McMahon fixed in 1891. It was the degree to which their administrative and intellectual categories, those bureaucratic distinctions, those lines on the map, persisted beyond the physical presence of the empire.
So to what extent do the foundational classifications made by an 1809 observer viewing the world through the organizing lens of Kant and Hegel still define the political and social reality of the region today?
It's a question of how long a colonial map can endure after the cartographers have all gone home.